everyone, and welcome to today's CFPR seminar. And so today we are very happy to have Professor Isha Chatterjee with us to share her work. And so Professor Isha Chatterjee is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Maryland, College Park in 2020. And her primary research interests are in the fields of demography and gender, work and family. And her work has been published in lots of very prestigious journals, such as Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Population Studies, Demographic Research, +1, and very recently, and one of her related work to today's presentation is published in Population and Development Review. And so outside of academia, and Professor Chatterjee also worked in the past as a consultant at the World Bank on a variety of projects. And so without further ado, let's welcome Professor Chatterjee to present her work on Indian paradox. What is the relationship between women's education and labor force participation, U or J-shaped? And so logistic-wise, we still will let Professor Chatterjee to finish the presentation first, and then we'll have like a Q&A session. And so along the way, if you have burning questions, you can just type in the chat box or just type I have a question, and we will collect the questions together in the end of the presentation. Okay, thank you. And Isha, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Singh. So I'll just start sharing my screen right now and get to my presentation. Okay. So good morning, everybody. And first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. So today's talk is going to be based off on two papers that I have had. So the first of the papers is called Rising Education and Declining Women's Employment. And this paper was with Professor Sonal Desai and Professor Reed Bannerman at the University of Maryland. And the second paper on which I will emphasize much more today is a recent paper in Population and Development Review with Professor Reed Bannerman, and it's called Women's Low Employment Rates in India, Cultural and Structural Explanations. So let me just get to the talk. So today's talk is titled Indian Paradox. Why is the relationship between women's education and labor force participation U-shaped or J-shaped? So before getting into this question, let me give you a little bit of background context. So India has one of the lowest rates of women's labor force participation rate. In fact, if you look globally, in 2012, it ranked around 84th out of 87 countries, for which there was available data in terms of rate of female labor force participation. Not only is women's labor force participation low in India, it has been declining over the decades. So while in 2005, it was around 33.5%. In 2013, it declined to around 27%. And in 2019, this went down to further about 22%. And this is according to data from ILO. And this is for women aged 15 to 64. So why is this happening? So there are many studies that kind of look at why women's labor force participation in India is so low. So one of the reasons that has come out is that shifts from low levels of education to intermediate and secondary level education. But why should that matter? Usually we would expect that, with an increasing education, more opportunities, people are getting there is more likelihood of getting employed and so on. But why should shift out of low levels of education to intermediate levels of education lead to declines in labor force participation for women? So we see that in India, this relationship between women's employment and her education level is J-shaped or U-shaped. So usually the neoclassical economic theory, what would it tell us? So once people kind of get more education, there is greater human capital accumulation, they have higher skills and they are able to get higher earnings. And this would kind of lead to greater labor force participation. But is this happening for women in India? No. What we see here, this graph is from the IHDS data, And here we see that as you go from being illiterate, so when a woman is illiterate, the predicted probability of being employed is around 0.53. It goes down to around 0.22 when she for women who are secondary school educated, and it just goes up slightly to about 0.28 when they get college education. So you see that with an increase in education, labor force participation, like probability of being employed, is declining, and then there's just a slight increase. Why is this happening? So basically, first, before getting into why this is happening, let's see where India is placed in the global context. So is India unusual, or is it unique? Is it the only country where this is happening? No, it's not the only country where this is happening. It is unusual, but it is not unique in showing this kind of a U-shaped or J-shaped relationship between women's education levels and her labor force participation rates. So taking data from Integrated Public Use Microdata Set International Census data, IPUM's international data, what we see that if you look at the crosstab for education and labor force participation for women aged 25 to 59, what you see that there are only 14 countries out of 71 where women who have secondary school education are less likely to be employed than those who have primary complete education, right? So because otherwise you'll see that women who have secondary school education are more or less more likely to be employed than primary school. But for these 14 countries, you don't see that. And of course, there are different kinds of trends, So in some sub-Saharan African countries, you'll see an inverted U. In a few countries like in Turkey and I think Indonesia, you'll see a similar curve similar to India. But there aren't too many countries where you see this kind of paradox. Like only these are like more or less outliers. So when you look at this difference in terms of the percentage who are employed in percentage who are employed by education, so this difference between secondary school and primary complete, India has the second largest difference. So for example, in India, the percentage of women with less than primary school education who are employed is around 36%, and for secondary school it is only 18.5%. This difference is the largest in the case of Rwanda. So yeah. So now let's get to why this paradox. So in the past, there have been three main reasons that have been talked about. I mean, often they are not empirically tested, sometimes they have been empirically tested. So this is what we start off with. So the first reason is other family income effect. Okay. So what does this mean? So basically, theory would predict that the relationship between education and women's labor force participation is governed both by a substitution effect and by an income effect, right? So what does this mean? What do we mean by the substitution effect? So when a woman gets more education, they are probably more likely to gain, be able to command higher wages, and they are more likely to kind of get more money for that, and therefore they are likely to substitute the time that they would spend in leisure or homework and into labor force participation. So they would be more likely to be spending that time in the labor force rather than staying at home and doing their household work or kind of engaging in labor activity. On the other hand, there is this income effect. What does this income effect say? That once a woman gets some amount of education, some more higher education, then she's more likely to suppose she gets 1 hour. In that 1 hour, she's probably likely to get higher wages than what she would earlier. So now she can rather spend more time in homework or leisure because she's getting more money by putting in less time. So there are these two conflicting substitution effect and income effect. But in the Indian context, there's this other family income effect. And what does this say? So women who are more educated are more likely to marry men who are more educated and who have who belong to richer families. So therefore, there's a lower incentive to work. And given the cultural, of course, it would depend on the cultural context, as I'll come to later. But, with this rising incomes of Indian households, women kind of probably withdraw from the labor market and focus on their role in status production. So, I mean, that's what they say. So whereas women who are from the poorest households, they have the need to work. And the substitution effect would only kick in, say, post-secondary or high secondary school, where probably they're getting high enough wages to kind of go out and work, and the family is being okay with that. But for intermediate levels of education, women's labor force participation gets depressed. Next, you have lack of demand. And what do we mean by this? So this means lack of demand for, say, workers who have intermediate levels of education, and particularly women. So what we see in our first study in demographic research is that women who have had a certain level of education, they prefer salaried jobs, right? They don't want to work in manual jobs anymore. So maybe there is a lack of availability of salaried jobs in their region. So that's why probably they are not able to work. So maybe in regions where you see more salaried jobs, you'll see a less curvilinear relationship between education and labor force participation. Third is cultural stigma. So probably so if a woman resides in an area where there are less stringent gender norms and it's less patriarchal, probably there the substitution effect is more likely to kick in and and overshadow this other family income effect, and therefore we expect that we would be likely to see a less curvilinear relationship between education and labor force participation in areas which are more liberal. Finally, the third explanation is something that we suggest in our paper. This has not been commonly seen. So this is called occupational sex segregation in clerical and sales jobs. So clerical and sales jobs are kind of the majority employers for women with intermediate levels of education across the world. So in India, we say that these jobs are predominantly male dominated, and that's why women are being kept out of these jobs, and that's why, which is kind of the primary employer for women with intermediate levels of education, and that's why probably we see this shape curve. And I'll come to it one by one. So let's get to the data part. So what data am I using for this? So we are using data from the India Human Development Survey. So the India Human Development Survey, the first round was collected in the year 2005, and it's a nationally representative sample of 41,554 households and 215,754 individuals across all states and union territories of India. In 2011-12, they kind of recontacted the households, and there was a second wave, and there was about 83% recontact rate, and the sample was of course augmented to make up for whoever was lost, whatever attrition was there from urban areas. So we use appended data here from IHDS, and the sample size is 72,620 women. And in the present study, we use only married women aged 25 to 59 who were not too young to continue kind of their education and not too old to retire. And that's why we stayed with this sample here. Okay. So next, let me get to the dependent variable. So the major dependent variable here that we look at measures women's labor force participation rate is a binary dummy variable, which kind of takes a value of 1 if the woman works for greater than or equal to 240 hours in any kind of work except animal care, and otherwise it takes a value of 0. So IHDS has a much more detailed measure of this work because, unlike NSS, which kind of asks women only about principal and secondary status activities, IHDS has modules for different kinds of work. And for example, household work, wage labor, non-farm business, etc. And they kind of ask which household members participated in each of these activities. So that's why we kind of get a more precise measure. So this is how we measure labor force participation. Our key independent variable that measures women's education level is measured by dummy variables constructed for the 6 categories of education. So we have illiterate for those who have no education, like who have not gone to school at all. You have pre-primary, so women who have kind of taken education from class 1 to 4 but have not completed their primary school. Third, you have primary and post-primary, so those who have completed their class 5 or primary school education and also those who have some sort of secondary education but have not completed their secondary degree. So educated up to 5 to 9. Then you have secondary and post-secondary education. So this is women who have completed their class 10 or may have done 11, but they have not finished their high school degree. So this is what is the next category. Then we have higher secondary to pre-college. So those who have completed their full schooling and may have attended some college but not gotten a college degree. And finally, you have college graduates or higher. So this is how we measure education. Some of the control variables that we have in our model are log of other family income, survey, area of residence, meaning urban or rural, number of children aged 0 to 5 in the household, number of children aged 6 to 15 in the household, number of married women in the household, spouses' education in years, age dummies, and caste and religion related numbers. So coming back to our research question, what was the research question here that we had to start off with? What explains this counter-theoretical J or U-shaped relationship between women's education and labor force participation? Yeah. So let's start with looking at the first one. So we have started by talking about other family, right? So what does this graph show us? So this orange graph is like the J-shaped curve that I had shown in the first slide, right? So this is without any control variables in the model. If you look at the predicted probability of employment by education level. So you see that this was a J-shaped curve. So now, after taking into account other background factors and holding other family income at the same level, what happens? Does the curvilinear shape go away? No. You see that this actually becomes a more strongly U-shaped curve, but it does explain some part of this decline, because the decline becomes flatter when you hold other family income at the same level. You see that the decline in the probability of being employed, it becomes flatter as you go from pre-primary to secondary. And of course, post-secondary education, if other family income was held at the same level, then the probability of working would increase at a much sharper rate. So college educated women would be more likely to work, would have a greater likelihood of working, and so is the case with secondary and higher secondary school education. But still, this doesn't become like a conventional positive curve that the new classical theory would suggest. So, like I said here, so other family income effect, the curve kind of shifts from a more backward J-shaped relationship to a strongly U-shaped one. The decline between illiterate women and secondary educated women is attenuated, but the negative slope still remains. And hello, can you hear me? Yeah, did I get paused because I thought the electricity was.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the decline between illiterate women and secondary educated women is attenuated, but this negative slope still remains. And you see even higher participation for college graduates once you take into account this other factor. The second thing that we found from our study in demographic research was that the type of work a woman finds affects the education labor force participation relationship. So like I said, women, once they get, so you see that, okay, so if you look separately for the relationship between education and labor force participation for agricultural wage work, non-agricultural wage work, and other kinds of work, you see a negative relationship between education and labor force participation. But for salaried jobs, you see that if we have done it separately, for that, as education goes up, the likelihood of being employed will increase. So it means that women, if once they get certain levels of education, they would prefer certain white-collar jobs. They don't want to do manual jobs anymore. So possibly, especially those who have intermediate levels of education. So we see that these are jobs that are kind of acceptable to women. And therefore, we come to our next point, lack of demand, that maybe these women reside in regions where they don't have enough salaried jobs. And that is why they are not kind of going into the labor force. So this kind of brings us to our second point, which is the lack of demand. So basically, lack of demand for women with intermediate levels of education in salaried jobs, because of a lack of salaried jobs. So, so we basically, like I said, the previous study showed a positive relationship between education and women's labor force participation for salaried jobs, and women with intermediate levels of education kind of prefer salaried jobs. So the availability of salaried jobs in the district could be a reason that would explain this U-shaped or J-shaped relationship, whereby we would expect a less curvilinear education-employment relationship in case salaried jobs are most abundant, right? So then if there are enough salaried jobs, then these women with intermediate levels of education will get these salaried jobs, and then you see a positive, that will bump up that downward slope and it will make it positive. So let's see what happens here. And so how do we, before getting into the results, let me just tell you a little bit about the method. So the key measure for district level demand is looking at the percentage jobs in the district that are salaried, and this is aggregated from the IHTS data. So we use actually multi-level logistic regression. So we use hierarchical linear modeling. And why do we use that here? So the odds of a woman participating in the labor force are not kind of independent of each other, right? So women who belong to the same district or same area of residence could have exposure to similar characteristics that are specific to that district, right? So therefore, in this study, we use this two-level model that HLM kind of helps us take into account the non-independence of observations within the groups. Okay, so we also include cross-level interaction between district-level availability of salaried jobs and education levels in the model. So coming to the results and looking at the predicted probability of employment by education level for districts with high and low level of salaried employment, what do we see here? So there are two curves here. The first one shows the relationship between the probability of being employed and education level for women who reside in districts where 0% jobs are salaried, So this is the orange one on top. And the maroon curve shows us the relationship between education and the probability of being employed for women who reside in districts where 50% of the jobs are salaried. So 50% of the jobs are salaried. So this kind of captures like 90th percentile of the districts. So this kind of indicates a very high percentage of jobs in the district being salaried. But what do we see here, surprisingly? We see here that the U-shaped curve still remains. And in fact, if you see, except for those with college graduates are hired, women who reside in districts where there are like 0% jobs are salaried have a higher probability of being employed across education levels. So then, so that means we still have some more to explain here. So basically we see, like I said, the linear positive relationship between of women's education and their labor force participation is not observed in districts where more suitable employment is most widespread. And the U-shaped relationship still holds, right, between the relationship between education and labor force participation. So what we see here is that the mere availability of salaried suitable jobs, suitable white collar jobs, does little to pull moderately educated women into the labor force. So this brings us to our third point. So this is the third point is cultural stigma. So regions where patriarchal norms are dominant, cultural reinforcement of staying home should help overshadow incentives of higher pay for educated women. So the substitution effect probably kind of comes into play only after higher secondary education, where potential wages women get would be higher and the prestige associated with the jobs, would be could help overcome some of these patriarchal norms and restrictions in mobility. So we would expect less curvilinear education employment relationship where patriarchal norms are the weakest. So again, similarly for the methods section here, we kind of measure district level gender norms using the percentage of women practicing ghungat or purdah. And this is also aggregated from the IHDS data. So of course, for robustness checks, we've used other measures at the district level, that measure indicators of mobility or segregation, and we find similar results, but that is not reported in our main text. So we include cross-level interaction terms between district-level gender norms and education dummies. And here again, we use multi-level logistic regression because, as I said, the probability of a woman being employed is not independent of each other, and like it depends on their district characteristics, and therefore HLM kind of helps us to take into account the non-independence of observations within groups. Okay, so let's get to the next slide. So this graph shows us the predicted probability of employment by education levels for districts with high and low levels of purdah observance. So the graph on the top, which is the orange graph, it shows us this relationship between education and labor force, probability of being in the labor force for women who reside in districts where 0% women practice ghungat or purdah. And the maroon graph shows us the result for women who reside in districts where 100% women in the district practice purdah. But what we see here is that while women who reside in, say, regions where there are less stringent gender norms are more likely to be employed, this happens actually across education levels. It's not just, so it doesn't change the shape of the curve. The curve still remains U-shaped, right? So you still see the same kind of relationship that happens here. So again, a linear positive relationship between women's education and their labor force participation is not observed in districts where patriarchal norms are the weakest. So in these regions, the decreasing level of employment with moderate levels of education is in fact most pronounced. So now what we see is that there's a kind of a lack of empirical support for these structural and cultural factors, right? So of course there is some support, but we cannot completely do away with this U-shaped curve. So this kind of poses an important challenge. So this brings us to our fourth explanation, which is occupational sex segregation in clerical and sales jobs. So jobs that kind of typically require secondary education are gender segregated as male jobs in India, Although in much of the rest of the world, these jobs are gender segregated as female jobs. So if you look at the rest of the world, if you look at high income countries, you'll see that around 2/3 of the clerical and sales workers are women. And even so, it's one of the most female dominated occupation categories. Similarly, low and middle income countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., you'll see that high levels of female concentrations are found in clerical and sales jobs, which is similar to that in high income countries. But in India, you do not see that. Okay, so if you look at the 2011 census of India, and if you look at the 2-digit occupational category, which is like, looking at salespersons, demonstrators, etc. So 92% of these jobs are dominated by males. And if you look at office clerks, it's about 81.4% are males. So this is very unlike what you have from the rest of the world, where these jobs kind of act as a primary employer for women with intermediate levels of education. So, so then what do we do here? So how do we kind of measure this? So this is a challenge to us because there is very little variation in sex segregation of clerical and sales work across India. So what happens is that, so for the previous two cases, the percentage of salaried jobs available varies across regions in India. Cultural norms, gender norms, they vary across regions in India. But if you look at sex segregation in clerical and sales work in India, it's predominantly male across the board. So we can't really look at, a multi-level model and, compare regions with low and high occupational sex segregation, because this is kind of predominant. So therefore, we base our analysis on a counterfactual simulation. So what do we do here? So we try to re-estimate the labor force participation and education relationship as if most of the clerical and sales jobs were held by women, as is common in much of the world. So we create this counterfactual situation. And what do we do here? So we match each male clerical or sales worker with a similar woman who is not employed. So we are matching each male clerical or sales worker with a similar woman who has same characteristics as that man, but who is not employed. So basically, most matches are based on exact matches using survey, state, urban or rural area of location, caste, religion, education category. So it's an exact match. So it's just that the woman is not employed, but the man is employed in a job in clerical sector. So while matching, if the number of matching women is greater than the male clerical workers, we select the women randomly and recode them to being employed. However, when the number of matching women is less than male clerical workers, we relax the matching criteria, first for state and for very few cases rural and urban, but we've not had to do this mostly. After matching the male clerical workers with women who are out of the labor force, we recompute the labor force logistic regression using women's recoded work status. So now, how do we measure the binary dependent variable that we had? So what we have here is now the same like binary dependent variable that captures women's workforce participation, which takes a value of 1 if the woman works for greater than or equal to 240 hours per year in any work except animal care, plus now we have some additional non-employed women who were matched to a male clerical sales worker who had the same characteristics as us. So now we have this additional people also being recoded as good. Otherwise, of course, the variable takes a value of 0. So this graph kind of shows us the predicted probability of employment with all controls by education level for the actual and simulated sample. So you see that while the actual sample, you see that it was more U-shaped. Here you see that as you go from primary complete to college graduate, this increases. So you see that, of course, from some primary to primary, it's higher, but it's the decline still remains because obviously much of these clerical and sales jobs will be taken up by people who have at least primary complete education. So that's why you're seeing that. But this kind of clearly points out that there is occupational sex segregation in these jobs that are kind of held by people with men with intermediate levels of education. So basically, occupational gender segregation is kind of a more likely explanation for low levels of employment amongst moderately educated women. And in some ways, the sex segregation explanation is similar to, like, it's like a combination of the demand side and the gender stigma explanation. So, like demand side explanations, occupational segregation is, of course, another rendition of a scarcity of relevant jobs hypothesis. However, it also needs to be seen that women are kind of excluded from these jobs, even if these jobs are available. So, what the past literature kind of has failed to incorporate is the recognition of the gender nature of the labor demand, right? White collar employment is not stigmatized for these moderately educated Indian women, and nor is it a small or declining share of labor demand. So white collar employment is kind of unavailable to Indian women because they are being excluded from these jobs based on their gender. So this is something that we kind of suggest here. So gender segregated exclusion of women from white collar work kind of depresses the employment levels of Indian women with moderate levels of education, and just a growth in service sector is not enough. So in some of our robustness checks, we kind of had some other simulations where we just double the size of clerical and sales jobs, or double the size of public industry without changing the gender composition of these industries. And in that case, you still see that the U-shaped curve remains. But if once you change the gender composition of these certain sectors, which are heavily male dominated and which are kind of appealing to women with intermediate levels of education and are primary source of employers for these women across the world, then you see that it's a much more positive relationship, right? So basically, we need more attention needs to be paid to kind of this gendered nature of work and labor demand. And the role of patriarchy in reducing women's labor force participation, of course, it is well recognized, but patriarchal norms are like usually blamed for supply side factors. Like that, okay, like family level factors. But our contribution is to suggest that the future, like the influence of gender norms may be differential across occupational structure as well, right? So in India, it appears that while white collar jobs are especially subject to male opposition in the current moment, this kind of has unfortunate consequences for women who have intermediate levels of education. So therefore, there need to be initiatives to integrate women with intermediate levels of education into white collar jobs. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very comprehensive presentation. And I guess now the floor is open for comments and questions from the audience. So you may either just tap in the chat box saying that you have a question, or you can also use the raise hand reaction. Yeah, Vincent, please. Oh, Vincent, you're
yeah. Hi, Prof. Chatterjee. Thanks so much for the presentation. I thought it was very well. It was a very interesting presentation. On so many different levels, conceptual, methodological, as well as empirical. So I really enjoyed the talk very much. I'm very curious as to. So as you've rightly pointed out, I think in many societies, we see it's not the case that men are concentrated in clerical and service work in the middle. But I was surprised then, when you were saying that there's no variation across the districts.
Right.
So this is very persistent, very consistent throughout India.
Yeah.
And why is that so? Why is it that there's no variation in this middle section all across the country?
Yeah, I think it's because these jobs are kind of predominantly male. I don't know. That's what, this needs to be studied in more details. We need to probably, do organizational level studies and figure out more about occupational sex segregation. Because, for a bigger study, if you just look at it, it's not too much variation. It's mostly male dominated. So that's why probably women are being kept out. So I don't know, there are probably these implicit biases and explicit biases that employers have for women, that, okay, when they employ them, they probably need to have other facilities in place, childcare policy, this, that. So sometimes these small firms are not able to afford these kind of policies that kind of bring in women. So it is very important that, and there are so many of these factors like networks, men probably, and the kind of jobs. There are so many, and so at the firm level, at the hiring level, also there can be so many implicit biases that exist. So I guess it's not just supply side, but it's like from organization's point of view. Also, there are a lot of challenges that women probably getting.
Which sort of brings me to my next question. The fact that it is so pervasive throughout all the districts, and you see this sort of male dominance in this sector. Does this in fact then suggest actually there's a cultural stigma, to sort of this sort of cultural male dominance that
in organizations?
Yes.
It is. So it is actually, that's something that, it's a very tricky point, trying to able to kind of unpack what part of it is cultural and what part of it is just demand side driven. So of course, cultural factors are really, really important, but how do we exactly measure it? So sometimes you can look at gender norms broadly, but cultural factors are definitely important, and of course, it's so related, right? Like whatever is the cultural norms in the organization is also driven by what the society is doing. So that is definitely there. So it does explain some of it. But otherwise, I would say that, to know more about this, there should be firm level studies and, more in-depth firm level studies to kind of unpack really what is happening. So
Thanks very much.
I think there is some study. Okay, thank you. I think there is some study by Professor Dr. Maitrey Das and colleagues in some Madhya Pradesh about this, addressing this demand side, and it's a very interesting paper. It's by so that paper kind of talks about some of these factors. So it's a firm level study. So that is actually interesting. So
agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Agnes.
Thanks, Prof. And also thanks for Prof. Chatterjee for your wonderful presentation. Actually, I have 3 questions. The first one is more a clarification question. Actually, I didn't hear clearly for your for the dependent variable for the 240 hours. Does it include both paid and unpaid work?
It includes paid work, and so if they're employed in any kind of job, which could be in their family enterprise, it could be in their family firm, it could be in their it could be in outside wage work, salaried work, any kind of work that they do, as long as that kind of adds up to more than 240 hours per year, as long as they're working. So it does not include this animal work, which is kind of taken as a part of animal care and all that. So we don't take into account household work or animal care work, but we do take into account if they're actively involved in the business or farms or some other enterprises.
I see. So the 240 hours is for salary work. Is for salary work. No matter whether it is outside the family or
it could be for. So it's not necessarily for overall labor force participation. So we had a different analysis for salaried work where we only looked at salaried work. But overall, when we are talking here about labor force participation, it is for any kind of work, not just salaried. It could be wage work, it could be for wage work also, it could be for salaried work, it could be for anything. So, but as long as they are kind of participating in an economic activity.
I see. Yeah, and the second question is for the. I remember there's a figure at the beginning of the presentation, and I think one in the orange color line is that the percentage of the salary job in the district, and one line is for the 0% of the salary job, and one is 50% of the and I'm very curious and why across all the educational levels the probability of employment is always higher for the in the areas of 0% of salary job than the 50%. So do you mean that is all because of the reason of the cultural stigma?
So I think it could be because of the occupational sex segregation. That's the thing. So that's what. So we thought initially women are more likely to kind of work in salaried jobs because they find it more acceptable. But even when these salaried jobs are available, they are being taken by men. In fact, they are also probably even for men with intermediate levels of education, probably they also want those jobs. So when these jobs are available, so it looks like it's clearly going to the men rather than women. So then the woman ends up doing a lower end, other kind of job. So maybe, in fact, in districts where more salary jobs are available, women are less likely to work. That's what we see here. And that's possibly because of this occupational sex segregation in these sectors, which are considered, something that is acceptable to both men and women once they get certain education. But at entry level, it is much more difficult for women to enter that. So that's why. So maybe they are being pushed to do other kinds of work.
I see. And my last question is for the end of the presentation for the matching part. And the figure I see I saw that after you conduct the exact matching, the probability of employment for women, as I remember, is the highest probability is in the group of higher education, is the college education instead of the intermediate level of education of women. So can I explain that, interpret that, even if we have a counterfactual situation that all the clerical and service sectors are occupied by women's employees, that will can we explain that even though this situation is successful, or will we explain that there will be more college graduate would likely to would have a higher probability to take this kind of clerical and service jobs instead of the intermediate level women to take this kind of job?
So of course, college educated women would be definitely more likely to get it. Maybe again within those occupations also there will be many sub occupations, right? So there are some jobs which people would with intermediate levels of education take it, but college educated women would take probably higher end jobs, which can also be classified as service jobs or white collar jobs, but may not be the same thing that they are competing for. But the likelihood of employment obviously will go up then with education, but you at least see this more conventional thing happening, that at least this gets bumped up, because these sectors are some of the main sectors that would kind of employ women, where women are also willing to work, their families are also fine, and it's also a fit in terms of aspirations. And so that's what for college educated, of course, the options will be much more, and they can do other kinds of jobs also, but it would also but the culture is so that is also there.
Thanks you. Thanks for your explanation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nanxing. Actually, I have a question as well. So thank you so much for this very insightful and comprehensive presentation, and you provided like many of those like bigger pictures, right? And how the aggregate level processes has influenced that. And so I'm actually wondering about like another potential mechanisms, but I'm not sure to what extent that it's also relevant to Indian society, is this emphasis on children's education, or now in many Asian countries, this a practice of intensive parenting. And so many of times, and especially in those better established and this higher social class families, they focus on children's all around development and education to a large extent. And given that situation, many times those highly educated mothers, they will withdraw from the labor market and to focus on the education of and nurturing of children as a project, as a cause. And so in that case, that I'm not sure that to what extent that it's also possible that in India, many of those like highly educated mothers are actually withdraw from the labor markets to focus on this educational project as well.
So I think So we don't take into account directly all this thing, but what is right is this kind of probably gets partially captured by the other family income effect, because so the richer families, they would expect they have this these cultural norms. These are more stringent in those kind of families, right? That they won't want women to go out and work once they feel that they belong to a rich family, and then some of it could be also that you take care of the child and all of that. So unless say the woman has a very exceptional job, she's a CEO, she's doing something very great, then otherwise they won't. So that kind of so I think that probably this, of course we don't measure it directly, but other family income effect kind of does that. So as you see that when we take into account this other family income effect, then the increase in the probability of being employed goes up. It's much steeper, right? Like as you go from being secondary, like the decline also becomes flatter, and from secondary to college educated women would be much more likely to work if that was not there. So if they were not like rich privileged families which want the mother to kind of engage in with the child or stay at home, so that probably accounts for a little bit of that, and then you do see that the curve will become much sharper. The increase would become sharper. So you take that in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Isha.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments from the audience? I guess then that's it, right? And that's conclude our today's seminar. And thank you very much, Professor Chatterjee, for this very exciting project. Before we call it a day, and I would make an announcement for next week's CFPR seminar, and so it will be happening next Friday, and still at noon. And so the topic is Intergenerational Relationship in Contemporary China, How Culture Matters, by Professor Hu Anning from the Department of Sociology at Fudan University of China. Okay, and then I guess that's all for today. And thank you, Professor Chatterjee, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope all will have a nice weekend. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thank you very much.